He swore an oath to uncover the truth, until the system he served buried him for it. Detective Andre Bishop wasn't just a detective, he was a prodigy. The one who could read a crime scene like a book, the one who talked to witnesses like they were family, the one who believed that justice was a light bright enough to disinfect any darkness. But when he brought his own department's darkness to light, handing over irrefutable proof of a fellow officer, Peterson, repeatedly tossing a subdued and helpless young man, they didn't give him a medal, they gave him a pink slip. They called him a liability, froze his pension, and had security escort him from the building he'd called a second home. The rookies who once asked him for advice now snickered as he packed his desk. The sergeant he'd covered shifts for looked right through him. And the institution he'd dedicated his life to, it left him to drown in the silence they'd created. That's when the detective in Andre died. And something else, something colder and more precise, was born. Now, he has no badge, no precinct, just a list. The officer who pulled the trigger. The partners who stood by and watched. The dispatcher who lost the 911 calls from witnesses. The captain who signed his termination with a smug smile. To Andre, their silence wasn't just a failure to act. It was the crime itself. They have no idea he's the one hunting them. They only know their numbers are dwindling, one by one. This is the story of the detective they tried to erase, and the perfectly executed justice he delivered in return. Welcome to Cold Justice Chronicles. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories. Inside the sterile, air-conditioned interrogation room of the Atlanta Police Department, the silence was a weapon. Fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow on the polished steel table that separated Detective Andre Bishop from his superiors. Across from him sat Captain Hayes, a man whose ambition was etched into the deep lines on his face, and Sergeant Donovan, who shifted his weight, unable to meet Andre's gaze. At 32, Andre was the sharpest mind in the homicide division. He was raised in the West End, the son of a respected, retired APD patrolman who taught him that a badge was a responsibility, not a shield. Today, Andre was testing that belief. He had just submitted a file containing body camera footage, witness statements, and a timeline that proved Officer Peterson had used his taser on a non-resistant suspect 5 times. Far beyond protocol, far beyond humanity. The kid was already on the ground, hands behind his head. The room was a pressure cooker. Captain Hayes leaned forward, his voice a low growl, stripped of all pretense. "You don't burn one of your own, Bishop. Not in this city. You bury it. That's how this works." Those words were a death sentence for the man Andre thought he was. It was a confirmation that the blue wall wasn't for protection. It was for concealment. That loyalty wasn't to the law, but to the lie. Andre's reply was quiet, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Then I was never one of your own." Those words were a death sentence for the man Andre thought he was. It was a confirmation that the blue wall wasn't for protection. It was for concealment. That loyalty wasn't to the law, but to the lie. Andre's reply was quiet, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Then I was never one of your own." That sentence was a declaration. It exposed a rot that ran deeper than one bad cop. It was systemic. Andre had always believed his job was to find the truth, no matter where it led. His father had taught him that the detective's greatest tool wasn't a gun, but integrity. But here, inside the walls of his own precinct, integrity was a liability. As Andre walked out of that room, the camaraderie he once felt evaporated. The nods in the hallway turned into stares. The partners he'd trusted now saw him as a threat. The betrayal was swift and absolute. He was the detective who solved the unsolvable cases, who brought closure to grieving families, who still believed in the promise of the badge. By exposing Peterson, he hadn't just accused one officer. He had accused them all of the sin of silence. Captain Hayes's warning echoed in his mind. The department didn't tolerate disruption. To break the code was to be broken by it. Yet Andre knew what the footage showed. He knew the cost of looking away. His father's voice, firm and steady from years ago, came back to him. "The badge is heavy, son. Make sure you know what you're carrying it for." Andre had tried to carry it for justice. Now he knew the badge itself was the weight, designed to hold the truth down. He was on his own. The investigation had just begun. Before the report, before the betrayal, before he became a ghost haunting his own city, Andre Bishop was a part of Atlanta's heartbeat. He wasn't just a detective who worked in the community. He was from it. He'd shoot hoops with kids at the local park, his laughter echoing off the pavement. He'd sit on porches in the West End, listening to the neighborhood elders share stories, their wisdom a grounding force in a city that was always changing. He was known as the one you could talk to, the detective who didn't see a case file, but a family torn apart. He saw victims, not statistics. He joined the force not for the power, but for the purpose. He wanted to be the one who got it right, the bridge over a chasm of mistrust that had divided his community and the police for generations. Before the APD, Andre had a different life. A full scholarship to Georgia Tech for computer science. He was a gifted coder, a digital native who understood systems, vulnerabilities, and backdoors better than anyone in the precinct. He left that world behind, choosing the tangible impact of police work, a choice his father, a retired patrolman, both admired and worried about. The badge is heavy, son. His father had told him at his academy graduation, his hand on Andre's shoulder. Make sure you know what you're carrying it for. Those words were his compass. He tried to navigate the two worlds he inhabited. He wore the badge with pride, but it came with a code. A demand for a loyalty that often required him to ignore the quiet injustices he saw every day. He wanted to be a good detective and a good man, but the line between them was becoming a razor's edge. Every case he solved, every thank you from a grateful family, fueled his conviction. But every hushed conversation about a mishandled arrest, every report that went missing, chipped away at his faith. He saw the pain in his community, the weariness in their eyes when they looked at his uniform, and he carried the weight of their disillusionment. He was the man standing in the gap, trying to hold two worlds together. But sometimes, a man in the middle is the first one to be crushed. And Andre was about to learn that when a system is built on silence, the first voice to speak the truth is the one it's most determined to destroy. The apartment was too quiet. The city's pulse, the distant sirens, the bass from a passing car, the murmur of life from the street below, felt a million miles away. Andre Bishop sat in the dark, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating a face carved from stone. The termination wasn't just the loss of a job. It was an erasure. The official reason was insubordination and failure to follow department protocol. It was a clean corporate phrase for what was really a punishment for telling the truth. He had the real evidence on a secure, encrypted hard drive hidden in a fireproof safe. The unedited body cam footage of Peterson. The audio from a witness whose 911 call was mysteriously logged as a prank. The internal emails from Sergeant Donovan telling officers to align their statements. He had hoped, naively, that the system would investigate itself. That someone somewhere would do the right thing. That hope was a corpse now. His phone, once a constant stream of texts and calls from colleagues, was silent. He was a pariah, a ghost. He scrolled through a local news site. Another protest. Another family demanding answers. Another official statement from the APD promising a full and transparent investigation. A lie. All of it. He stood and walked to the safe. His father's old service revolver was inside, cleaned and oiled. Next to it was a folded black hoodie, and the hard drive. He held the small, metallic rectangle in his palm. It was the key to everything. He could leak it all, burn the whole department to the ground from the safety of his apartment. But that felt incomplete. Leaking the truth would create headlines. It wouldn't create consequences. Not for the men who looked him in the eye and chose the lie. He sat back down at his laptop. His fingers, once used to write police reports, now moved with a different purpose. He wasn't writing a report. He was compiling a new kind of case file. A list. Peterson, the officer with the taser. Donovan, the sergeant who orchestrated the cover-up. The two officers who stood by and did nothing. The dispatcher who buried the 911 call. And at the top, Captain Hayes, the man who signed off on it all. He knew their routines, their favorite bars, the routes they took home. He was a detective, after all. He knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. This wasn't about rage. This was about logic. It was operational. He pulled the hoodie over his head. The fabric felt like a new uniform. He placed the hard drive next to the revolver. Not yet. First, they needed to feel the fear that they inflicted on others. First, they needed to understand that a detective never really goes off the case. For years, Andre had played by their rules. He believed in the oath. But the badge hadn't brought justice. It had protected the guilty. He wasn't a good detective anymore. He wasn't a detective at all. He was the consequence they had created. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware. But a storm was gathering. And when it broke, they would remember Andre Bishop. Not for how he served, but for how he balanced the scales. The quiet residential street in Decatur was a picture of suburban peace. Manicured lawns, sleeping houses, and the intermittent glow of streetlights. It was here, just after 2 a.m., Officer Peterson felt the first prickle of unease. He'd just finished his shift. The familiar weight of his duty built a comforting presence as he walked to his personal vehicle. He was one of Captain Hayes's boys, arrogant, protected, and certain he was untouchable. He never saw the shadow detach from the space between two cars. There was no sound, no warning, just a sudden, immense pressure as a forearm locked around his throat, cutting off his air. His training, his strength, it all meant nothing against the cold, calculated efficiency of the attack. It was over in seconds. When the body was found at dawn by a woman on her morning jog, the scene was meticulously clean. Peterson lay beside his car, keys still in his hand. There were no signs of a struggle. It looked almost peaceful, if not for the single item pinned to the collar of his shirt. It was a copy of his own falsified incident report, the one about the tossing. Key phrases were highlighted in red ink. Suspect was combative. Minimum force necessary. Resisted arrest. A single damning message. Watching the local news report from his darkened apartment, Andre felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse. Just the cold certainty of a mission underway. The news anchors called it a baffling, targeted attack, and the APD issued a tight-lipped statement promising a swift investigation. They refused to mention the report pinned to the body. They were already trying to control the narrative. But Andre knew this was just the beginning. The report wasn't just a signature. It was the first piece of evidence in a new case he was building. A case against the entire department. This wasn't random violence. It was a sentence being carried out. His mind was already on the next name on his list. The system's cracks were showing. The fear was a seed, just planted. And Andre knew, with the chilling clarity of a seasoned detective, that it was about to grow. The hunt had begun. The atmosphere inside the precinct was curdling. Fear, thick and foul, seeped into every corner, more potent than the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. 2 more names had been crossed off Andre's list. First, it was one of the officers who'd stood by and watched Peterson. He was found in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, slumped over the wheel of his car. The cause of death was a single, precise injection of a powerful sedative. Tucked into his uniform pocket was a printout of his bank statement, with a recent, unusually large deposit circled in red. Payout for his silence. Days later, the second silent observer was taken. This time, it was more public, more theatrical. He was ambushed in a downtown parking garage, his own handcuffs used to restrain him to a support pillar. On the floor in front of him, spelled out in zip ties, were 2 words. You watched. The APD was in lockdown mode. Official statements were generic, insisting the deaths were unrelated, likely gang-related retribution. But inside the walls, the lie was suffocating. In the locker rooms, hushed conversations were about the ghost of the APD, a phantom bringing a dark kind of justice. Detective Mariah Jones, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who'd once looked up to Andre, wasn't buying the official story. 3 dead cops, all connected to the Peterson case. She told her partner in a low, urgent voice, "The brass is calling it a coincidence? This is a purge." Her partner just shook his head. looking over his shoulder. A purge by who? A ghost. The killings were rattling the foundation of the force. The unspoken rule, we protect our own, was being turned against them. Now, that protection felt like a target painted on their backs. The fear was no longer about the dangers on the street. It was about the secrets in their files. For Andre, the growing chaos was a predictable variable. He was exploiting the system's greatest weakness: its corruption. Every lie they told the public, every denial, only made the fear inside the precinct fester. Officers started calling in sick. Veterans requested desk duty. The swagger and confidence that defined the force was replaced with nervous, darting glances. They were hunting a killer, but they were also hunting one of their own, and the paranoia was tearing them apart from the inside. Andre watched from the digital shadows, monitoring their communications, their panic. The message was being delivered, piece by piece. Silence is not safety, it's a debt. And the bill was coming due. The night was still. The air in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Dunwoody heavy, with the scent of pine and freshly cut grass. Inside a two-story brick home, Sergeant Donovan's wife was reading a bedtime story to their 7-year-old son. Donovan himself was in the den, watching TV, the day's stress melting away. His house was his sanctuary, a fortress against the chaos brewing at work. He had no idea the walls were about to be breached. Outside, a figure moved with impossible silence. Andre Bishop didn't carry gasoline or a weapon. His tools tonight were different. A set of lockpicks, his knowledge of alarm systems, and a singular, terrifying purpose. He slipped through a back window, a ghost in the sleeping house. He moved through the downstairs rooms, his steps lighter than a breath. He ignored the valuables, the electronics, and the wallet on the kitchen counter. He was not a thief. He was a messenger. He climbed the stairs, his heart a steady, cold drum. He stopped outside the child's bedroom, the soft voice of the mother a faint murmur, a flicker of something, a memory, a pang of regret, passed through him, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about them. It was about the man who thought his family made him untouchable. He entered the master bedroom. It was empty. On Donovan's pillow, he placed a single object, a small, wooden toy train, taken from the son's playroom. Next to it, he laid a flash drive. Then, as silently as he arrived, he was gone. An hour later, Sergeant Donovan walked into his bedroom. He saw the train first. Confusion. Then he saw the flash drive. His blood ran cold. He knew, with sickening certainty, what was on it. The unedited footage. The buried 911 calls. The entire case file Andre had built. But the message wasn't just on the drive. The message was the train. It was a whisper in the dark, screaming louder than any fire ever could. I was here. I can get to them whenever I want. The silence you're keeping to protect them is the very thing that's putting them in danger. Panic seized him. He checked on his wife and son, his hands trembling. The locks were secure. The alarm was set. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But his sanctuary was shattered. The next day at the precinct, Donovan was a wreck. He was pale, jumpy. His eyes hollowed out with a fear no one else could understand. He told Captain Hayes someone had broken in, but he left out the details of the train and the flash drive. He knew what telling the full truth would mean. He was trapped. Andre's psychological strike was a masterpiece of terror. It was a warning that his reach extended beyond the streets, into the safest corners of their lives. The message was clear: you can't hide. Your silence is a bullseye. The hum of clippers was the only sound that could compete with the heated debate inside the West End barbershop. The TV mounted in the corner showed a local news anchor speaking in grave tones about the ongoing investigation into the tragic deaths of several APD officers. "Tragic my ass," said an older man getting a lineup, not bothering to lower his voice. "They are tragic when they get a paycheck. They damn menace the rest of the time." "You heard what they called him?" A younger man scrolling on his phone asked the room. "The ghost of the APD. Nah, I saw a better one. They called him the Janitor. Cleaning up the trash the system left behind." The sentiment rippled through the shop. a mix of grim satisfaction and cautious hope. This wasn't just gossip. It was a narrative taking root. Andre Bishop's story, once a hushed rumor, was becoming a legend. Online, it was an inferno. An anonymous Twitter account at ATL Sentinel began leaking documents. Not just files related to the Peterson case, but years of citizen complaints that had been dismissed, misconduct reports that were buried, and screenshots of internal chats where officers joked about excessive force. The hashtag Bishop Did Right started trending in Atlanta, then regionally. The story was no longer just about a vengeful ex-cop. It was about a whistleblower who was forced to become a warrior. Memes depicted Andre as a shadowy figure, the APD badge melting in his hand. T-shirts appeared almost overnight, sold at street markets and online. One popular design showed a silhouette of Andre with the words, "He spoke. They didn't listen. Now he's making them hear." In the Fourth Ward, a massive mural appeared on the side of a building. It depicted a faceless figure in a hoodie holding a broken scale of justice, with the names of victims of police brutality listed behind him. Underneath, in bold letters, it said, "Some storms clear the air." The APD's attempts to control the story were failing spectacularly. Their press conferences, filled with stiff denials and calls for the public's help in catching a dangerous fugitive, were met with ridicule online. Every statement they released was immediately countered by another leak from at ATL Sentinel. The department wasn't just fighting a man anymore. They were fighting an idea that was spreading faster than they could contain it. They tried to paint Andre as a monster, but for a growing number of people in a city fed up with a broken system, he looked more and more like a hero. Andre Bishop was no longer hiding in the shadows. The community was putting him in the spotlight. They were telling his story for him. And through it all, the official silence from the mayor's office was deafening. They were losing control, and they knew it. The janitor was at work, and the city was watching him sweep. The 911 dispatch center was the city's frantic, beating heart, a place of controlled chaos. But tonight, the chaos felt different. It was laced with a chilling, personal dread. At her desk, a veteran dispatcher named Pam sat with her hands shaking, her face ashen. She'd been with the APD for 15 years, a voice of calm for people on the worst days of their lives. She was also the one who had taken the witness calls during the Peterson incident and, under pressure from Sergeant Donovan, had logged them as unfounded and rerouted them into a digital black hole. Earlier that evening, she'd found a package on her doorstep. Inside was a single, high-end audio headset and a note. "You hear everything. You say nothing. That ends tonight." Now, a call came through on a restricted line, one only high-level officials used. The voice on the other end was calm, cold, and instantly recognizable to her. It was Andre Bishop. "Pam," he said, his voice a flat line. "You have 60 seconds to patch me through to every open police radio channel in the city. If you don't, the next call you take will be for your own address." "I'm already watching." Panic flared in her chest. She looked around the room. Her supervisor was on a break. The other dispatchers were busy. This was real. She knew it. Her fingers trembled as she typed the commands. With a few clicks, she created a citywide open channel. "It's done," she whispered into her mic. Andre's voice, now amplified, boomed across the entire APD radio network, a ghost in their machine. "This is Detective Andre Bishop," he began, his voice cutting through the chatter. "You fired me for telling the truth. Now you get to hear all of it." For the next 5 minutes, Andre laid it all out. He played the unedited audio of Peterson tossing the suspect. He read the names of the officers who stood by. He detailed Donovan's instructions to falsify the reports. And then he played the 911 calls Pam had buried, the frantic voices of witnesses describing exactly what they saw. "The system is not broken," Andre's voice echoed in every patrol car, in every office, in the captain's handheld radio. "It's working exactly as you designed it, but the design is flawed, and I am the correction." Then, as suddenly as it began, the line went dead. The dispatch center erupted. Supervisors rushed in, shouting questions. Pam slumped in her chair, weeping. Across the city, Officers sat in their cars in stunned silence. The truth, raw and undeniable, had been broadcast by the very system designed to suppress it. They hadn't just lost control of the narrative. They had lost control of their own house. Andre hadn't just exposed a cover-up. He had hijacked their central nervous system to do it. The ghost was no longer just haunting them. He was inside. The sun beat down on the pristine green of the East Lake Golf Club, a playground for Atlanta's elite. It was here, among the powerful and privileged, that Captain Hayes thought he was safe. He had come to meet with the city councilman, to do damage control after Andre's citywide broadcast. He was arrogant, assured, a man who believed power was the ultimate shield. As Hayes lined up his putt on the 18th green, a sharp whip-crack sound split the air. It wasn't a golf club hitting a ball. It was the sound of a high-velocity rifle. The bullet found its mark with surgical precision. Hayes collapsed without a sound, his body a stark, lifeless shape on the perfect grass. Panic erupted. Patrons screamed and dove for cover. But the shooter was gone, a ghost who had melted back into the urban landscape. Near the body, propped against the hole's flagstick, was a cell phone. It was already dialing. A reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution answered. "Hello, check your email," a calm voice said. Then the line went dead. The email contained a single attachment, a zip file labeled APD_internal_affairs. It was everything. The unedited video, the audio files, the buried 911 calls, the falsified reports, and damning financial records showing payoffs to the silent officers. It was the entire case, gift-wrapped for the press. Within an hour, the story exploded. The AJC published the first article, and the raw footage went viral. Every news channel in Atlanta led with it. The public wasn't just hearing about the cover-up anymore. They were seeing it, hearing it, raw and unfiltered. The APD's wall of silence crumbled into dust. The official statements meant nothing against the stark, brutal reality of the video playing on a loop on every screen in the city. The assassination of a police captain was a massive story, but the reason for it became an even bigger one. This was Andre's endgame. It was never just about the list. It was about dismantling the machine of corruption. The sniper shot was the exclamation point, but the leaked file was the manifesto. He hadn't just killed a man. He had executed a lie. In the shadows, Andre watched the fallout. He had forced the city to look at its own reflection, and the image was ugly. Public outrage was a tidal wave. Protesters, emboldened by the truth, gathered outside City Hall and APD headquarters, their numbers swelling by the hour. The hunt for Andre Bishop became the city's #1 priority, but it was too late. He had already won. He had exposed the rot, and now the institution was forced to either cut it out or be consumed by it. The sniper shot was a final, brutal act of accountability. The city was in chaos, but for the first time in a long time, the truth was in the open. The final showdown took place in the skeletal remains of the old Pullman Yard, a sprawling industrial graveyard on the east side of Atlanta. The APD, armed with the full, damning truth and fueled by a mixture of terror and rage, had finally cornered him. They had used Detective Mariah Jones as bait, leaking a false report that she was meeting an informant there. Andre, monitoring their comms, knew it was a trap, but he also knew it was the final act. He walked into it willingly. SWAT teams moved in, their formations tight, their weapons raised. The air was thick with the promise of violence, but they were storming the hunting ground of a master predator. Andre moved through the rusted train cars and crumbling brick buildings like a phantom. He knew the layout, the angles, the blind spots. He had been a detective. This was just one last crime scene to process. The first shots were his, precise, disabling. He wasn't just a marksman, he was a strategist. He took out their spotters, their point men. 5 officers went down, not dead, but neutralized. Each shot was a message. You trained me for this. He was a one-man insurgency against a force he knew inside and out. The chaos of the gunfight was a symphony he conducted. The echoes of gunfire bounced off the decaying structures as the elite tactical unit found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought. But the numbers were overwhelming. A sniper from a distant rooftop finally got a lock. The first bullet tore through Andre's shoulder, spinning him around. He gritted his teeth, fired back, and kept moving. He was wounded but not broken. He made his last stand in the open, by the shell of an old passenger car. He faced the wave of advancing officers, his weapon finally empty. He didn't raise his hands. He simply stood there, his face calm, looking them in the eyes. In that final moment, he wasn't a monster or a ghost. He was Detective Andre Bishop, the man who had refused to look away. The volley of gunfire was deafening, a final, furious roar from the system he had brought to its knees. His body fell, and the yard fell silent. The only sound the frantic radio chatter and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Andre Bishop was dead, but his case was finally closed. In the weeks that followed Andre Bishop's death, the city of Atlanta was reborn in fire. The APD, bowing to immense public pressure and the threat of a full federal takeover, launched the largest internal investigation in its history. Officer Peterson and Sergeant Donovan were indicted. But the real change happened on the streets. Andre's name was not erased. It was immortalized. Murals of his face, stoic and resolute, appeared on brick walls in the West End, the Fourth Ward, and on the side of the barbershop where his legend first took hold. They called him the janitor, the sentinel, the man who cleaned the house that corruption built. T-shirts with hashtag Bishop Did Right became the unofficial uniform of a new generation of activists. Protests, once small and easily dismissed, became massive, organized movements demanding accountability and reform. His story forced a conversation that the city had avoided for decades. The narrative was split. To the establishment, he was a cop killer, a vigilante who tore the city apart. But to the thousands who marched in his name, he was a martyr. A man who had used the system's own violence against it to force a reckoning. They didn't celebrate his methods, but they understood his motive. He was the consequence of a promise the city had broken one too many times. The final scene of Andre's story wasn't the blood-soaked ground of the Pullman yard. It was a courtroom, where the young man Peterson had tossed was exonerated, his record cleared. It was a press conference, where a visibly shaken mayor announced the creation of a civilian-led oversight committee with real power. It was a quiet moment at a new mural, where Andre's father stood, looking up at the painted face of his son. A face of sorrow, of anger, but most of all of justice. Andre Bishop was gone, but his ghost still walked the streets of Atlanta. He had died, but in the end, justice was served. Thank you for watching Cold Justice Chronicles. Subscribe, like, comment, and share, and stay tuned for more stories.